Hi, good evening to everybody. I hope everyone can hear me. My name's Paul Smith. I'm the new chair of the Internet SG. Great pleasure to invite you all this evening even. I don't know what even time of day it is today. It's the day it's been. Thank you very much for giving up some time. I have great pleasure in introducing you to our speaker this evening. Our speaker this evening, as you know, is Amanda Brock, the CEO of Open UK. I won't do Amanda a disservice because she can explain her role and her organisation much better than I can. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over and say welcome to Amanda. And I'm looking forward to learning more about Open UK.
Thanks very much, Paul. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us this evening and for inviting me along to the BCS to talk to you tonight. It's a real treat for me to be speaking to you from my kitchen as I'm on holiday currently. I guess I've moved from one end of my house to the other, and you're joining me from my holidays. I'm going to talk to you tonight about a few different things: digital sovereignty, Gaia-X, new regulation, and Open UK. And I'm going to start by saying I'm sorry if I disappoint, because I'm not going to talk about any one of those in a huge amount of depth. You might say that I'm one of those people who knows a little bit about a lot of things and can be a little bit dangerous on that front. Or you might think that I'm telling you a story that pulls together lots of different threads to create a picture and a policy story for you this evening. So as Paul said, I'm the CEO at Open UK, and Open UK is the industry organisation for open technology. We describe ourselves as being about the business of open technology. And I've been in this role now since December 2019, so 14, 15 months, something like that, maybe even longer. Actually, yeah, even longer. And when I took that role on, I did so on the basis that I was going to transform Open UK and what it did. And I brought together a board of people who are well known in open across the globe, who are UK based, as many open people are. And we worked on this vision at the beginning of 2020. And our vision is to develop and sustain UK leadership in open technology. Now, I'm not really a Zoom user, and I don't know if you can see my slides or if you're seeing this over the top. So I hope you can see my slides properly. So we develop and sustain UK leadership in open technology. There we go, that's better. And what is open technology? So we shifted from open source software to open technology. And open technology for us was defined by one of our board members, John Laban, and he defined it as open source software, open hardware, and open data, the three opens as he calls it. And we did that because in 2020, as it was then, we know that data is at the heart of everything we do around technology. Whether you're in software, whether you're in hardware, you are definitely using data as part of your strategy, as part of your business model. It's central to everything we do. We also understand that software and hardware can become difficult to differentiate, particularly as you get into spaces like silicon. We found that as we started to work on activities in 2020, that whatever events we were organizing, whatever activities we were participating in, they very quickly fell into three pillars. And we developed three pillars being community, legal and policy, and learning. So the first of those communities about building a visible and loud community around open technology in the UK. I'll talk in a moment or two about our first phase of our Open UK report, State of Open, which was published in March. And when I do, I'll talk about the value to the economy, the value to GDP of open source software, only open source software, not open technology. And in doing that, I will work on a calculation using some old data. And that old data is some old GitHub data. And the figure that it gives for open source developers in the UK, brought up to date for today, is 126,000 open source developers in the UK. Now, I don't think that's the right figure. I think it's a much, much higher figure based on a number of different things that I've seen, none of which I can use as an authority. But if I was a betting woman, I'd be going for the region of 200,000 open source developers in the UK. Part of the reason I would make that bet is in the European Commission's reckoning, they have reduced the number of open source software developers by 230,000 as a consequence of Brexit. So I think my 200,000 is a fair bet. So from that, you can see that we are a large community, and that's just the engineers. If you think beyond that, when you look at open source organizations and companies generating revenue from open, you're looking at people like me. My background is in legal, and marketeers, people in comms, the people doing the documentation. There is a whole ecosystem around it. So you're definitely looking at several 100,000. Then we can add in the data and the hardware side. And the UK, again, is world leading in open data. We have Icebreaker One, we have the Open Data Institute, and many other organizations focusing on open data in the UK. And on the hardware side, we have people like Jeremy and Embicosm, where people I'm sure you know who are leaders in hardware, and we have quite a thriving open hardware sector. So we actually represent a very big community. Now, where we're very different from the other country organizations is not just this focus on open technology. And I will say we were the first organization in the world to focus on it. We saw a gradual creep in some of the others, but nobody else came out and took that leadership. We are also very different in that we don't represent just the local grown companies. So if we look across Europe, the other trade or business organizations focus on local companies, and they are a really important part of our constituency, but they're not all of it. And what we represent is the business of open. Now, what that means is that we represent people who are working in and around open source, who are working for non-technology companies or technology companies that aren't open source companies, whether they are UK based or whether they're international companies. As you can no doubt imagine, I'm sure many of you work from home, many folk in technology do anyway, but particularly in our open source space, we have a large number of people who are home-based working internationally. And for the UK, with the English language, first language, we can say what we like about the Americans. And perhaps, what is it, two nations separated by common language? It means that we end up with a lot of folk who are working in US companies. And we have this very, very large, very vibrant ecosystem around open in the UK, which has really not been recognised enough, folk. If we think about it, we were the biggest contributor to open source in the EU prior to Brexit. And we were the biggest by far. Germany was a close second and France a poor third. We're likely to have been around half the development community that they had. We're the fifth biggest contributor to the cloud globally in terms of open source software. And that piece around cloud is something I'll talk a lot about as I go through my deck. So we're really about recognizing the center of excellence that the UK is in open and pulling that together to create this loud voice, which can be heard. And we've done that in a number of different ways. I've mentioned our report. We are working with the National Museum of Computing on a room which we hope to launch in the autumn, which will look at the history of open with a focus on the UK. We created a New Year's honours list. If I say to you that there were 100 people, there could have been several hundred in that honours list. And the single tweet we sent out sharing that has had over 280,000 impressions on Twitter. You get a sense of the scale of what's going on here. We recently launched an ambassador program. We have over 100 volunteers working in and around the organization. We now have 30 ambassadors. We're aiming to get that up to 50. If anybody's interested, drop me a note after this. My email and my Twitter handle were on the first slide. We aim to increase our supporters through our ambassador program. And the ambassadors are each tasked with bringing in 5 to 10 supporters rather. Now, the reason that's important is that we effectively reinvented the organization. We appointed a board. They will be completing their second year this year. We've restricted our board to 2 2-year terms, and the initial board, half of them will step down this year, and we will have elections in November. And the people who will be entitled to vote will be those who've become supporters and been supporters for 6 months. And that requires a fairly nominal fee to be paid monthly. It's set at £5. You can take that down a bit if you feel that you can't afford it. So it should be pretty open to everybody. And our goal there is to build an active supporter group who are participating in that board election later in the year. And we also held an awards ceremony back in October last year that was sponsored by the law firm Bristow's. We'll be doing that again in 2021. It's scheduled for the 11th of November, and assuming that COP26 is a face-to-face event, it will be a hybrid event with a digital presence, but hosted from COP26, where we'll be hosting a day. The second pillar is legal and policy. And what we do with this is we use the impact, the power that we have from that voice of this huge community in the UK, and we use that to influence legal and policy. Now, this was probably one of the easiest areas for us to really develop in. Within, I think, 6 weeks of repurposing the organisation, we were invited in to speak to the UK trade folk negotiating the Brexit treaty, something I'll talk a lot more about as we go through. And we were invited in to talk to them about the source code provisions in those treaties and to help those work as the UK negotiated further its exit from the EU and its new trade agreements with other countries. Within only a few months, we had recognition from the European Commission, who had us down as the actor in the UK. I'll show you a little bit more of that in a second. We participated in Google v Oracle. Now, you probably all know that was decided by the Supreme Court on Monday, completely interrupting my holidays. I spent Tuesday talking to people about it. And the reason I spent Tuesday talking to people about it is Open UK was the only non-American participant in that case. And we participated through an amicus brief, a way of supporting Google in its case. And we did that with a number of open source organizations, including Tidelift and the Python Foundation. And we had great support from Van Lindbergh, a US attorney who drafted that for us. And we're absolutely delighted to see that it's going to be difficult to assert copyrights in open interfaces going forwards, and that the importance of that for open source is around these being a building block. So whether there's copyright or not is kind of irrelevant. It's really about opening that up. And it may not be in an open source license, but it's definitely a way for us to be able to build going forwards. And you can see that for this group, what we do is we review new laws and policy, but we also interface with activities like the Google litigation. And on the policy side, we do a number of things. One of the things I'm going to talk to you about this evening is Gaia-X, and we were a day one member of Gaia-X. We were one of only 2 UK organisations that joined, and we were described by one of the founders of Gaia-X as the UK's lifeline. We also have participated in COP26, at least in the application stage, and we have submitted a blueprint that I'll show you in a second for the data centre of the future. And we have submitted that to the Cabinet Office. We hope to be at the main event. We've actually applied for the IMAX Theatre, in for a penny, in for a pound. If we're going to be there, we might as well be there big. And we will be making a movie about data centres to share at COP26 if we get that slot. But we will definitely be there in any event. We will be participating in some of the other activities around COP26, giving a presentation on our data center of the future, and hosting a sustainability in open technology day on the 11th of November. Now, I mentioned that the Commission had recognized us pretty quickly as being the UK actor in open source, and you see there that GDS is the governmental one, and we'll talk more about what GDS has done around open source in a few minutes. I moved that, which doesn't help me because now I can't see the arrows. There we go. And on the policy side, one of the big things we've done is our report. And this was based to some extent on the European Commission's report, which is being worked on by OFE and Fraunhofer, and which was due to be published on the 1st of February. Rather than publish it on the 5th of February, they shared the data, they shared the formulae, but didn't actually share the report. So our report coming out in March, utilising their formula, was a healthy 6 weeks behind, but unfortunately, even that healthy 6 weeks wasn't enough, and we've published before they did. And the report is really important. It's important in that it backs up what I'm saying to you about the UK being a centre of excellence for open source. And it recognises that in a number of different ways, looking at the formula that's currently available to calculate the value of open source software alone to the UK's economy. We see that on that old-fashioned figure of 126,000 developers, which I don't agree with, we get to a valuation in GDP on an annual basis of up to 43.15 billion, which is a massive amount of money, something like 20-25% of the digital economy. And frankly, in my estimation, it's at least double that. And that shouldn't be a surprise when we think about enterprise and cloud, but it probably is. The report's well worth the read. You can find it at openuk.uk/state-of-open. It's also on the master menu and homepage of our site. This is very much phase one, and it's a literature review. It looks at what's already in place. We are now working on phase two, which will be a survey across business. I would absolutely love to have lots of you and folk participate. We will be going out with that survey in May, and anyone again can contact me and we'll include you in that. We will use that to demonstrate uptake and adoption of open source in the UK. And we will publish towards the end of June, beginning of July, our phase two report, sharing that and sharing some case studies. We'll also, for phase three, look at a different way of valuing. And valuation tends today to be done around lines of code in, total cost of ownership. That's what the EU is using, and that's what we've based our report on. But if I'm really honest with you, I don't think that's the right way to value it. I think the right way to value it is to find an economic model looking at output. And we've worked with a UK economist who was with Spotify until recently, a chap called Will Page. And Will has his book, Tarzan Economics, published on the 1st of April this year, well worth the read. It's a bit like donut economics. It's looking at how we measure a new digital economy, new ways of building revenue and generating value, which don't necessarily follow traditional models. Now, I mentioned COP26. This is our drawing of our submission. We plan to go and build this blueprint, and we are looking at how we can use circular economy, how we can move to an edge computing model with a 5G enabled data center that will entirely run on open. So it will be based on open hardware, it will run open source software, and of course we'll open up the data. We'll use alternative energy, and we will put the outputs of this back into the local grid, back into the district to help communities, whether that's heating a swimming pool, heating a community garden centre, or reducing power and utility prices for individuals who need that support in the local area. And we're doing this in a consortium of about 6 companies. Last week we had an Oscar winner producer join us, and he will be building our movie for us, assuming the Cabinet Office put us through. So that's only our second pillar. You can see we're busy folk. And the third pillar is learning. Now, Kavita Kapoor very kindly invited me to come along to this evening. And Kavita is a volunteer for Open UK as our Chief Learning Officer. And learning is one of the critical places. This is unfortunately as a deck on our old branding, and our new branding has a wonderful circle, and the circle represents the 3 pillars. And we start with community, which gives us a voice and an impact, which we use to influence, which leads into learning, because in learning, what we're doing is building the community of the future. And we create this circle that just goes community, legal and policy learning and goes on forever. And with the learning space, we've been doing a few different things. We focused a little on adult education. We have a future leaders group. We realized that our legal and policy group are actually all quite old. Most of us are over 40, a number of us are over 50, myself included. And we are the people who have this outstanding expertise around open source law, policy, and practice in the UK, which has allowed us to build this world leading organization very quickly and to do a lot of really good advocacy work. But that's not going to go on forever. And it's really important that we make sure we're bringing through the next generations, and that those are really diverse, and that we break down the digital divide as much as we can. And we do that partly on the level of the Future Leaders, which is a group started with lawyers, but it's much broader now. We do weekly training sessions around open source for them. They're generally at noon on a Friday. For May, they're going to be at 4:30 on a Friday. Because we're doing a West Coast edition where we'll have NASA and other friends in open source talk to us. The NASA one will be brilliant. It's about Perseverance rover and putting Linux on Mars, which has to float everybody into Expo, I'm sure. But those Future Leaders talks are a big part of our education. We also, unsurprisingly, focus on education in the traditional sense in terms of high school and tertiary education, secondary and tertiary. We want to build a GCSE, and we want to build a knowledge module for apprenticeship schemes. So to give ourselves some credibility, we started by looking at creating a kids competition last year, got hit by the pandemic and pivoted. And we pivoted away from bringing children to London, where we'd arranged to use Red Hat's Innovation Labs. They're sponsoring our kids competition, and where we were working with the double Grammy award-winning singer Imogen Heap, who had created a software glove. Imogen created a glove about 10 years ago, which I worked on, and she has had a lady called Helen Lee produce an open hardware kids version of the glove, which you can see here, the Mini Moo glove. And we distributed for free over 3,000 of those last year to children in the UK to allow them to participate in the course that we created for our competition participants. And it started for the competition participants. We broadened it out, we added an e-zine to the lessons, and we made that something that we ran as a summer camp last year. And we are a phase 2 winner of the GNOME Community Challenge. Last night, we found out that we were overall second out of 149 organizations. Haven't got our little medal or badge for being second yet, but I'm sure we'll get it soon. And it's nice to have a bit of recognition for the hard work that's gone into that. We also have a university group. We've mothballed it. We will repurpose that in the autumn. And we've just sort of worked with the universities, understanding that they are at a point where they are incredibly busy dealing with the changes that have gone on in the last year or so. But we intend to start working with them again in September. And in fact, we're going to just about donate to them curriculum. And I'll come to that in a moment. So if that all doesn't sound like enough to keep you busy, and you're the sort of person that gives BCS talks on a Thursday evening in your holiday, I have a couple of other roles. For the last 8 years, have been a European representative of the Open Invention Network, and OIN is the world's biggest defensive patent or IP organization in history. It has over 3,300 members who can join for free. Anybody can join for free. There is no control over sign up. Everybody signs the same agreement, the same non-aggression agreement, which is a commitment to use any patents you hold which relate to open source to the extent they read on a definition of packages. So called the Linux system definition, but it's much, much broader than Linux. So it's an agreement between all the participants not to sue each other with respect to their patents in that space, and also not to license each other. Until I think January, I chaired a UN advisory group on open source and IP. I sit on the OASIS Open Projects Standards Bodies Open Projects Group. I also am the editor of the second edition of this book, which will be published in September and will in effect be a gift of curriculum to the tertiary education system. And it will be a gift because although it's being published by Oxford University Press, it will be distributed also as an open access book thanks to the Veitch Foundation sponsorship. And that book is made up of around 20 different experts around open source, covering all aspects of open source law, policy and practice, from things like patents and copyright, licensing, through to growing communities, open source program offices, that sort of stuff. So it's pretty broad reaching. And the final thing that I do a lot of is this, talking to these days screens. It used to be to audiences all around the world. Regularly now it's my cat and a screen. I'm assuming I can't see you all, but there's 20 odd of you here tonight. So how did a nice girl like me end up in a space like open source? Well, having spent 20 plus years as a lawyer before I became a CEO, I joined Canonical at the beginning of 2008. I don't know whether you'll all know Canonical. It's the UK's, I think, biggest open source company today. Alfresco possibly was slightly bigger, and they got acquired in the run up to Christmas. And Canonical is the commercial sponsor of the open source operating system Ubuntu. Does way more than that, works across cloud computing. Back in around 2010, amazing chap, Simon Wardley, who some of you may know or have heard speak. If you haven't heard him speak, he's a great speaker. Simon was the cloud director at Canonical working on Ubuntu, and we went from 0 to around 73, 76%. of the cloud market almost overnight with the Ubuntu operating system. It's by far the biggest instance even today of an OS in the cloud space. And you might recognize somebody here. Back in, gosh, this is on the 31st of January / a few minutes into the 1st of February 2020, as my last trip anywhere before the pandemic hit and we all got grounded. And you'll see to my right, I don't know if I can move this annoying little thing that says I'm screen sharing. There we go. You'll see the lovely Kavita Kapoor to my stage left, to the right of this screen as you look at it. I'm with Jonathan Riddle. Kavita, as I said, is our Chief Learning Officer. To my right is our Awards Committee Chair, Jonathan Riddle, and to his right is Cheryl Hung, who is leading light in the Cloud Native Foundation, which I'm going to talk to you about in a moment. Now, if you look at Jonathan carefully, you'll see he's got a very anti-Brexit badge on, but he's also wearing a badge that says Open UK Heart FOSDEM. And we were all hosting a stand at FOSDEM for Open UK. And we were giving away tea and biscuits with the Brits, which went down rather well, I have to say. We had gathered on 31st of January outside the Commission to say goodbye to the EU. What else would you do if you were in Brussels on that date and time? And we have different opinions about Brexit. It doesn't really matter what we think, to be quite honest. It's all irrelevant now, because what's happened is the UK has Brexited from the EU, and it's happened as an act of digital sovereignty. So it's very much about the sovereignty of a nation state. And we've seen different countries go down that sovereignty route in different ways. In Germany, a few months before we Brexited, there was a court case which established at the highest level that German law overrode European law and that Germany's laws and the German state had sovereignty over Europe. Our way of dealing with it was a little bit more blunt in terms of walking away from a union, but it again was an act of digital and data sovereignty, an act of sovereignty, of political sovereignty, and it's representative of geopolitical shift. And I think that having gone through that, we are better equipped to talk about geopolitical shift from the UK than almost anybody in the world. But we're certainly living in a time of geopolitical shift. Now, for me, I've worked since 2000 internationally. I have not had a job that was UK focused really since then. I've worked in multiple countries. Like many of you, we've all worked in tech. I left Canonical in 2013 and worked for a couple of years in a law firm purely working on open source. I worked for a data center company. I worked for a MNO out of Amsterdam doing digital financial services in emerging markets. So I've had a broad variety of tech experience through all of which I've continued to work on open source projects. Because when I joined Canonical, I joined as a corporate commercial lawyer, and I wasn't really expected to become a big open source person, but I absolutely fell in love with open source. And when they were looking for a CEO to make Open UK into something bigger, having first said no, I changed my mind. And I changed my mind because of two things. One was that I saw a shift globally, a part of this sovereignty process where people were starting to look geographically, particularly in the UK as a consequence of Brexit, but starting to look geographically and then continue to collaborate globally. The second thing was this, and this is Europe's digital decade. Now, for the UK, we were absolutely groundbreaking in open source. In 2010, I was one of a number of people who were part of a Cabinet Office advisory working with Liam Maxwell, who was the CTO, who reported into Francis Maud, big advocate of open. And we were able to help them to build a business plan and other policies that are pervasive across the UK's digital requirements requirements, rules, regulations, to the extent there are any around digital in the UK, which require open source. They require an open first approach. The problem is they don't have any teeth. And what we were seeing in Europe is a shift increasingly to open source. And I was concerned that with Brexit, we were going to miss out on the benefits of that. And I wanted to make sure that if I could influence it, I would. And I mentioned already the European Commission's report. This is what was done by OFE and Fraunhofer. They have had a couple of workshops. They had one in November, one on the 5th of February, where they shared their outputs. And we see this as a great example of the digital decade that the Commission sees in the next 10 years. And some of that, a lot of that has to do with two women in particular. We see Marguerite Vestager, not just having been the competition commissioner for about 8 years, but with Ursula von der Leyen appointing her also as the EVP for digital across Europe, the EVP responsible for this digital decade. Now, Vestager is a really important figure in this whole conversation around sovereignty, around the digital shifts that are happening, and around understanding high tech or big tech. Because she spent all that time working in the competition authority, she's really got nitty gritty deep down into the revenue and commercial models being used across the tech sector. She has a better understanding than almost anybody of where the money goes and how it shifts. It won't be perfect, but it's certainly way ahead of any other regulator I've seen. And this is an excerpt from a letter that Ursula von der Leyen sent, I can't say her name, Ursula von der Leyen sent in 2019 to Vestager. And you'll have seen I normally speak to pictures, not to words, but I wanted to share this with you. And she says, changes in digital technologies and geopolitics are already having a profound effect on the lives of Europeans. We are witnessing major shifts all the way from global power structures to local politics. What we do now will determine what kind of world our children live in and will define Europe's place in the world, creating a Europe fit for the digital age. Now, that's a really strong statement, but if you flip Europe and European or Europe's for UK or British or China or Chinese or US and American, you get a sense of what every government is driving towards at the current moment in time in terms of its digital strategy and its digital hopes. And when we look more at that European strategy on digital and on data, we see here that it includes covering how strong concerns have been raised over the economic and social influence of non-EU technology companies, which threatens EU citizens' control over their personal data and constrains both the growth of EU high technology, their term for big tech, companies and the ability of national and EU rule makers to enforce their laws. And what they're talking about is what's happened over the last 2 decades since I started working in and around tech. In sort of 96, 2.5 decades. And what we see is this shift to these big companies having a lot of power and a shift to data being at the center of what's happening. Now, I would recommend to you that you look at this document, and it's a European Parliament, an EPRS briefing from July 2020. And in this, they not only recognize the shift that's happening in Europe around digital and data sovereignty, the push to the digital decade, but they recognize an acceleration in that process. And that acceleration, it comes out of the pandemic and the concerns that were raised partly through the test and trace apps. And test and trace apps are an interesting one for the UK, but we're not the only country that had some problems. Germany started with a centralized database, as did the UK. They pivoted faster and they weren't just open source in their licensing, they were open source in their approach. France had problems where, again, they wanted to host data that the Google, Apple powers that be. This is Dundee, my cat, who likes to join these talks. The Google, Apple powers that be own the API, the Gaia API, which they used to have some level of control over the data that was captured. And they sort of took a position, almost bizarrely, that they knew better, that they were more trustworthy than the state. And that hasn't gone down very well in Europe, kind of unsurprisingly. And a lot of this digital and data strategy comes from Germany and France. They're pushing very hard on it. If you think back years ago, we heard the French talking about building their own cloud a long, long time ago. And that has pushed the acceleration of this digital strategy. Now, this is an 8-page, as I say, EPRS document. I highly recommend you read it. When you get to page 8, you'll see that I've highlighted the word open. And what they're looking at is a forward-looking approach to digital markets regulation and to make online platform ecosystems and online activities more open, fair, and predictable. In particular, rules imposing, I'm going to miss that algorithm, transparency. And what a lot of this comes down to is transparency and trust, the very essence of open source, open technology, that we make things transparent. And by doing so, we create trust. And they want the same to happen with data. There's a lot of talk about data sovereignty and bringing data home, bringing it back to the local country, giving citizens control. I'm sure many of you have seen the work that Tim Berners-Lee has done in his new company. He's created these pods where individuals can control their data, and actually the NHS is trialing that. There was an amazing article maybe 3 weeks ago in the Times talking about how government today is database, and when they get it right is because there's an existing database. And they used the pandemic, they used test and trace as an example of getting it wrong, where we had new databases being built, not being built well, not working well. So test and trace a bit, not so much. And then you get to look at the rollout of the vaccine. And actually, we use the GP system, we use databases that have been really polished. 10 years ago, everybody was complaining about the NHS databases and GPs. Now those have been worked on, and actually they were just sitting there perfect, ready for the rollout of the vaccine. So when we look at government as database, we see how that works. And then again, we reinforce this message, the importance of data, and that the idea of data sovereignty, bringing the data back to the citizen, allowing citizen control and understanding, whilst at the same time government recognizing both for themselves and for business and revenue generation that data is central. Now, going back to my EPRS briefing, as well as the 8 pages, there are 24 recommendations listed out. You see 23, foster open digital ecosystems in line with the Digital Principle 6, which requires open source software standards, etc. Now, number 1 on that list was Gaia-X. Number 2 is about data, and it's already been complied with. But number 1 was Gaia-X. And Gaia-X is a federated data infrastructure for Europe. It's built on open source. It's going to be very open. As I said, Open UK is a day 1 member. We have been very active already. We can foster opportunities if anybody wants to get involved or to talk more about it. I think there are 1 or 2 other UK companies that have come on board now, but it's very few. And it's a table that we want to be at. It's a table that we want to sit at and see what's happening in terms of this 10-year digital strategy, this digital decade for Europe. Because whether we believe in Brexit or not, we've exited, and although we are no longer one of the 27 EU member states, we are still in Europe. And we sit in this really interesting position between Europe and the rest of the world. We're a sort of teeter-totter and a seesaw. And that teeter-totter, if we totter in the right direction, gives us an opportunity, and it gives us an opportunity to be a focal point around technology, to be a central hub, whether it's on data and taking data from the EU or whether it's around pure technology. And I think that's going to be very important for us. Now, my own participation, as I said, has been around the open source piece. And for me, I've helped with building out their contribution agreement and process and the licensing. And I've been really pleased with how that's gone so far. I think we'll be making a social media statement either this week or next around that, which you should look out for. Again, if anybody wants to talk about Gaia-X and involvement, I'm more than happy to do that in more detail. I know it's a hot topic and one that's probably not discussed enough in the UK. What I can say is that we're seeing data hubs being built across Europe. Hopefully there'll be a UK one that we will have involvement with, which will be the access point into bidding for work in Europe. But it's all about data, and it's all about building an infrastructure on European principles and policies, which frankly aren't so far removed from any other country. And that data piece is really important, and how we manage that data in a post-Brexit world is important. From an open source perspective, I saw a few worrying things in the autumn. And if I'd been giving this talk, I'd be telling you about being taken off shortlists for boards and all sorts of other terrible things that the Commission were doing. I'm sure it happened in both directions as part of the messy divorce that was going on, and that really what matters is collaboration, because a lot of what's being built is being built on open source and it can only be done through collaboration. but that seems to be shifting. On the data front, what we saw in the autumn was leaked stories like this one saying that any data sharing services with EU data would have to be established in the EU. And of course, post-Brexit, we're not. And it wasn't just the EU and the UK and Brexit that was really part of this geopolitical shift, or is now. What we also saw was the EU quite actively taking a defensive approach to China, something that the US were also doing. You couldn't have missed it. And Trump has definitely changed the world, as this page says. Whether Biden will manage to balance that out a little bit, we don't yet know. We're seeing steps. And the UK also took steps against China with the ban of Huawei from the 5G infrastructure, at least in July last year. But what we saw coming out of Europe around data was a concerted set of activity against the US and against the big or the high-tech companies, as they call them. And we saw that come through a number of different routes. The first, I very disingenuously heard some people from the Commission say that their activities came from Schrems, and it's just not true. Schrems happened as a consequence of data sovereignty, but it didn't happen through the Commission or the Parliament. And it happened back in July. You can see the 27th of July was when this statement was made. Now, Schrems is a campaigner, a privacy campaigner, an individual, and Schrems 1 involved him having the model clauses set aside. And those model clauses were a standard thing that lawyers use to be able to transfer data from one country to another, from an EU country to a non-EU country. So they were in all of our contracts where there was any data processing happening. And it was just a standard. It was something we relied on to avoid reinventing the wheel or doing audits. As we saw that being set aside, and that the model clauses were not held to be adequate, we moved to using the adequacy ruling. And the adequacy ruling is that a country outside of the EU is deemed to have adequate data protection laws, so data can be transferred there. And that would currently apply with the EU and any country that has an adequacy ruling, which the US used to have until Schrems 2. And with Schrems 2, we saw a decision for the CGEU, the European Court of Justice, as was, that the US was not an adequate jurisdiction. And that applies whether you're talking about intercompany agreements, transfers of data between big multinationals entities, or whether you were talking about intercompany, so data being transferred from one company to another into the EU. So if someone is processing your data in a cloud environment, for example, that would apply. And the sort of reasoning behind that, I think, was mainly PRISM and the changes in laws in the last few years in the US, which allow the US security services to access data, in particular from social media, and where people may not really understand that their data is being accessed and the importance of that data privacy, which is all part and parcel, of course, of this whole this move to Gaia-X and this digital data sovereignty in Europe. We then saw discussion and decisions about the UK. Now, Schrems only applies to the US. It doesn't apply to Asia, where a number of countries have these adequacy rulings already, but who knows, there may be more. But for the UK, we were left in a position where we didn't quite know what was happening with Brexit, and the adequacy ruling allowing us to continue to supply services based on European data was worth quite a lot of money to the UK and was very important. And we saw back in, I think, I think it was February, 19th February, we got the draft decision that the UK would get an adequacy ruling. Now, that's not yet final, that's going through a process. And the concern there is that there are rumblings of changes within the UK which could have a significant impact if they do. We then saw in December 2 pieces of proposed legislation come out from Europe on the same day, the Digital Markets and the Digital Services Act. And the Digital Markets Act is a competition type set of rules that are focused on gatekeepers. They will have up to 1/6 of group turnover as penalties. And they have a 3 strikes rule, which is really new. So if an organization had 3 rulings against it, it's possible, if deemed proportionate, that the Commission could require them to divest certain companies. Digital Services Act, on the other hand, goes back more to my days in FreeServe in the late 90s and early noughties. Back then, I was part of a team of 12 at Dixon's running FreeServe. We were in the Wild West and we created internet law. And we did that by talking amongst ourselves across different organizations, really dealing with what was going on in the early stages of the internet. You know, things like mispricing, how contracts were going to be formed, that kind of stuff way back when, return rights. And we sort of came to conclusions that were logical as a group of people managing all of this. And then we lobbied government and we lobbied to create legislation. In Europe and the UK, it was based on the distance selling and the e-commerce directives, and then the legislation in the early 2000s that backed that up. In the US, it was the Digital Millennium Copyright Act 2000. This was 20 years ago, and we're still relying on those laws. So it's hardly surprising as we start to take on a digital world and look at a digital decade in Europe that they're asking for change. And I think we'll see that change along with the UK's digital harms provisions. The bill is due at any time. We'll see a lot more in this. And it's not that those of us working in this 20 years ago were wrong. It fitted for the time. I don't think anybody would have assumed that that would still be in place 20 years later. And what we always find is that regulators are running to keep up. But 20 years is a long time. And when we were asking for this legislation, none of us could imagine that there was going to be a pandemic. And during that pandemic, actually, people were going to be using something called Twitter to get their news. Very, very naughty, difficult subject, because you're looking at a couple of things. You're looking at how we have regulation and control while still having freedom of speech. And intentionally, 20 years ago, the decision was made that platforms were platforms. They were sort of a mere conduit, they were a mere host, they were not editors, and that was very intentional. Now, I've mentioned that the Digital Markets Act in Europe, at the same time, we had a digital markets unit announced in the UK looking at the same type of stuff from a competition perspective. And unlike Europe, we don't have a digital strategy. And what we've had so far this year, when we've called for that digital strategy, is DCMS giving us 10 tech priorities, which are worth a look at. They do talk about opening up data, but they seem to have missed the value of open in these. And it is something we're actively lobbying and engaging with them on. The online harms white paper, the UK equivalent, is due to be made into a bill, as I say, at any time. Now, I'm going to pivot for my last few minutes, and I'm going to talk to you about something slightly different but highly relevant, which is cloud. Now, this is a slide that I included in most things I do from CNCF, the Cloud Native Foundation. And if you know about cloud, you'll know that Kubernetes is donated to CNCF by Google. A bit like Linux and the whole ecosystem around Linux, Kubernetes has generated an ecosystem. The card is also a tribute to the late Dan Cohn, who created it, who died sadly prematurely last year, not of COVID, but way too young. And you can see there's over 1,500 packages in these cards, or organizations in these cards, which have more than or they have market caps in the trillions and funding in the billions to have built this enormous ecosystem. And I think it was the Tidelifter report that said something like 90% of stacks have open source in them and 70% of them are open source software. Now, this is all very relevant to what we're seeing, or what we have seen happen in the Bay Area in particular around open source. And open is a great way to grow a business. It's a great marketing tool almost, although it is much, much more than that. And it's been wrongly used as a marketing tool in some ways by certain companies. Or they have had the right intentions, they just haven't either understood the licensing or how they're going to generate revenue. And what we saw in January, to the outrage of the open source communities, was Elastic move from an Apache 2.0 open source license to SSPL for their Kibana and Elasticsearch. And they did that, they would say, because of Amazon. And Amazon, we've been talking about the big tech interactions with Europe and the importance of data, and the Gaia-X and the infrastructure piece. And part of that is a pushback to create its own data and infrastructure in Europe from the European Commission. And it's also, like Elastic, a bit of reaction to the big cloud providers. And what we see here is Amazon doing nothing wrong, in fact, using open source software, but being accused of strip mining. Now, they're doing nothing wrong from a licensing perspective because they're absolutely allowed to use open source once it's released on an open source license. And there is no discrimination against individuals, against field of use, against technology allowed on an open source license. SSPL is not an open source license, it's a proprietary license. It caused a huge amount of confusion. The lawyer who drafted it also drafted something called the Commons Clause, and even putting a license out on a proprietary basis, but dressing it up with a name and treating it as if it's part of the open source ecosystem causes great confusion. The justification is this strip mining, which the New York Times wrote about in 2019. And that's the allegation that they're using the software without giving back. They're taking advantage in these big cloud companies, not just Amazon, but Amazon was singled out here. And as a result of that, what we saw was a pushback where there was a lot of discussion about open source and the licensing. And people were saying, well, maybe there's a need for an alternative. Maybe there's a third way. So you would have proprietary, you'd have open source, and you'd have something else. And that something else would be a sort of shareware, public source type of licensing for code. And it would make the source open, but not open source. And of course, although there's a lot of talk about this, nothing has actually happened. And although it's been described as a third way, I think actually what's going to happen this year and is going to be important to all of us is a fourth way. And the fourth way comes out of Margaret Vestager and Ursula von der Leyen and their understanding of the revenue models and in technology and the risk and the potential of regulation. And I think the folk that run these big tech companies actually are very, very aware of what they're doing and they're very aware of the markets. They're smart. People running the cloud environments understand them. And where they may currently have vendor lock-in or supplier lockout around the service layer, around the kind of packages that Elastic was complaining about, I think we'll see a shift. In fact, I know we're already seeing a shift, and that shift started in 2019, in April 2019 with Google. Google entered into a number of revenue share agreements with open source companies. And then we saw, even in the run up to Christmas, Grafana creating one of those deals with Elastic. Now, to wrap up, and I've talked a little bit longer than I meant to, but why does this all matter? Well, for me, this whole picture matters because of open source. And this is me with Linus Torvalds back in 2019. I haven't had my regular update photo with him because, of course, we're all grounded. And I would get this photo once a year at the Linux Foundation's open source conference in Europe. I guess I'm probably the only middle-aged lady that goes to have her fangirl picture taken with Linus. Linus and I are the same age, and in many ways, we're like-minded people. So you probably don't want us to be the ones telling you why open source is important, why it generates transparency and trust. So let's go to Microsoft. This is my mate, Steve Wally, and he's speaking at that Linux Foundation conference, this time in Edinburgh in 2018. And he's keynoting. He was keynoting because Microsoft had just donated its patent portfolio to Open Invention Network. You may remember I described them as the biggest defensive IP organization in history. And they had done that because they've been on a journey. And they've been on a journey where, I guess 20 years ago, Steve Ballmer described open source as a cancer. Then 2018, Satya Nadella, who is CEO in 2018 and today, asks that Microsoft is judged by the open source community by the actions it has taken in the recent past and the actions of today and in the future, not of the past, a message of or a request for forgiveness. And Steve Wally explains very well. It's very, I think it's an 11-minute presentation. It's well worth listening to. He explains Microsoft's shift, Microsoft's journey or change on three things. Firstly, 10 years ago even, customers did not ask for open source. Today they do. Secondly, cloud. Everything has changed. The cloud and platform world in the last decade has irreversibly impacted and shifted tech. And he points out that Microsoft runs a cloud product, Azure, you might have heard of it. And for them to have a cloud product, because the cloud infrastructure, particularly the public cloud, is almost entirely based on open source, they have to not only be able to use it, but contribute back and deal with the open source community. And thirdly, lastly, and actually I think probably most importantly, there is a generation of developers who've grown up since 1989. Actually, 1991 was the release of the Linux kernel 30 years ago. They've grown up accepting open, expecting it as a norm, and understanding that the open methodologies are by far the best way for engineers to develop code. And that if Microsoft wants to compete and to hire developers, it has to offer them the opportunity to work in open source. Now, that coding, my last few moments just wrapping up with you, that coding being open is critical. And what we've seen over the last few years, I'm told that in the pandemic, we saw it happen at an accelerated rate, is digital transformation. All companies today either have their products developed, distributed, or utilized and consumed using software. And that software today is open source. Every company is a software company. Every company is beginning to understand the impact of that shift. They don't quite yet understand that they are open source companies. And when they do in the UK, Open UK will be here to support them. And what we're going to be working on, as I said to you in our second report over the next quarter, is demonstrating to those companies how much open source they're actually consuming and then the value of that. Now, for me, one of the reasons I fell in love with open source was that it's all about collaboration. No matter how much geopolitical shift we see, no matter how much digital or data sovereignty, no matter how much we bring those back to our countries or focus on our countries, no matter how much I represent Open UK and the centre of excellence that the UK is in open source, ultimately we focus locally to collaborate globally. And that global collaboration, that diversity, that inclusion, and that breadth of what we achieve is why we create open source and how we create open source, which is fundamental. So even as we look to this sovereignty, even as China bifurcates the internet, as we see Gaia-X being built to build an infrastructure for Europe, it's all being built on open source. And the only way to continue that innovation is collaboration. So from Open UK's perspective, we're all about inclusion and having everybody who is interested come on board and participate. If you would like to join us, please do. Please contact me or Kavita, who I believe many of you know. Please become supporters and come along either to our events, our lectures, or get active, get involved in one of our organisational activities. And with that, finally, a bit longer than I expected, I'm done.
Brilliant. Thank you, thank you, thank you. It was a brilliant opportunity to Amanda to learn a little bit more about Open UK. We've got a couple of questions that people have put in the chat. I just want to make sure that that's covered properly. First question, is the UK still part of Gaia-X? And I appreciate it's been discussed in length. I just want to make sure we've got very clear answers.
So the UK is not part of Gaia-X. UK government has not engaged in Gaia-X. The 27 member states, I believe most of them have. Germany and France have committed to fund the build of the infrastructure. Open UK is one of the first day member companies, and if anybody is interested in finding out more or getting involved, contact me and we'll see if we can find a way to get you participating in something around Gaia-X or to join one of the briefings, but UK Gov is not currently engaged.
Okay, second question I've got here. Gaia-X vision seems to also be about independent infrastructure, not going under the benevolent watch of Five Eyes, for instance. How can this work for the UK? I'm confused by UK in Gaia-X. What does it mean in terms of supply to Gaia-X but disconnected from it?
Okay, I think I get the gist of that.
Yeah.
What I would say is that there are hubs for Gaia-X across the EU, and there will be hubs beyond the EU. So we fall, when it comes to EU regulation, we fall into rest of world now. So Open UK's legal committee still contributes to any consultations that happen. And in the same way, Open UK contributes to Gaia-X. Now, we can do that as a rest of world member. We could set up a hub in the UK. And for UK companies who want to bid for work, that's going to be something that's very important that the UK has one of those hubs, because that's where the tenders are going to be pushed out that involve data. And that data sits at the heart of so many things we all do that we probably don't even realize. So be aware, if you listen to this again or you go back and check anything, I am talking about the organization Open UK, not UK Gov, although we have had some good discussions with UK Gov about being involved in different parts of Gaia-X.
Follow-up question from Nathan. It's difficult to add you on LinkedIn. How can we connect?
It is. Yeah, so I apologize for that. You can send me I think a message, you can email me and I'll connect with you. I couldn't cope with the amount of time I was having to spend every day dealing with marketing. And I did do what they told me to do on my privacy settings, and I was still getting, dozens of people who were approaching me trying to sell me stuff. And because I represent a community, I can't just dismiss people. I genuinely have to go through each of them and look at who people are and see whether I should be connecting and talking to them. And it was just too much. So you can blame LinkedIn sales tool. On the front of this deck, you'll find my direct email address, because I am genuinely normally quite open. You can send me a message on LinkedIn to connect with me, and I will then connect with you, or DM me on Twitter at Amanda Brock UK. You can see Open UK there also, Open UK_UK. And there is an Open UK group on Twitter that if you apply to join, I'm sure we'll let you in.
Have you got a LinkedIn group as well for Open UK?
Yeah, that's what I've just, sorry, I said Twitter, LinkedIn. There's a group on LinkedIn as well. And it's very, very open. Everything is very open apart from my LinkedIn profile at the moment.
Okay, good. Does anybody else have any more questions for Amanda? Because I wouldn't want anybody to regret not asking something later, given her seniority and everything that people have learned tonight.
Don't know about seniority, but you can drop me emails if you have questions. Don't worry about it. I'll follow up with you or DM me.
Hey, is it all right if I just open up?
Please do, sir.
Hey there, Amanda. You've been really, really great. Hi, how are you doing?
Sorry to talk for so long. I talked a bit longer than I meant.
No, it's great. You got really good storytelling skills. And one of the things that was really interesting was the discussion of sovereignty and when it comes to data, and what this actually means, not just on a political level for the UK, but also for AI and the liability that comes with AI moving towards having its own legal personality. And I know
it's slightly beyond me, and I'm going to be really honest about this. The ethics of AI terrify me. And my own view is that we ought to have something like a UN that's a not super, but supranational body that sits over the member states. So your sovereignty brings it back locally, and your supranational sits across it. And I really worry about AI and how ethics is going to apply, because I'm quite open in many ways. And one of the things that I believe is that I shouldn't be telling you what to do unless you're adversely impacting me, right? So everybody should have their own moral code, their own ethical code. So I don't feel that I'm the person who should dictate it. And each country is going to do something similar around AI on the ethical side with its data. What happens if the country next door doesn't agree and they decide it's okay to use it for, I don't know, nuclear purposes or war-based purposes, but you've decided you won't do that? And I think there needs to be some global collaboration, regulation around it. And on the sovereignty piece, it is really difficult, because what you have to balance is bringing something local and managing it locally, but still being able to exert control locally and collaborate globally. And it's not an easy path to follow, which is why I think we need to talk about it a lot more than we are, and to make sure that when people are not doing it, we call it out and we try and fix it.
No, exactly, and it's quite interesting because we're having a lot of let's call it decentralization experiments
Yeah,
been happening recently.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
one of the first modern ones was actually the European decentralized experiment, where there was power devolved from the nation states in Europe to this supranational body,
hmm,
right? And more recently, this has accelerated even more with the advent of blockchain technology, which
yeah,
us to collaborate even more. And it's one of the most
hmm,
open technologies that you can get. It's open source by nature.
yeah.
And from
And
this,
that's what I think. You're right. You're hitting the nail on the head there. So I think there's a few different things. You can go back to the web, you can look at blockchain, you can look at cloud, and all of that has become essential infrastructure in society and will only increase. You can look at AI and ML and the impact that's going to have on us, and all of it sits on open. So what we tend to do is talk about those as discrete areas without looking under the hood and understanding what's underneath. And
mm,
your average Joe isn't going to understand what's underneath and doesn't really care. But actually, if we don't recognize that it's open and it's been built on collaboration and keep it that way and keep that transparency, we're going
yeah,
to end up with problems, and we're going to end up not being able to collaborate, and with lots of sort of forking on a local level. And
mm,
forking is not always a bad thing, but I think it could be really unhealthy.
mm,
And not having that, Linus Torvalds talks about many eyes, and that one of the benefits of open is you've got many eyes looking at all the bugs and the problems. And I think we're getting to a stage where we're also understanding from a security perspective that all software is a risk. It's not just open source, right? And
mm,
actually there is this advantage to open, that when you have a problem, you can see it and everybody works to fix it. And that
yeah,
we have this collaborative rather than this sort of secret hidden effort. I have a theory that I don't discuss publicly that often, which is that actually open source is probably less of a risk. And it's probably less of a risk than closed, because we know what's there and we can see it. And we've spent decades around open building governance and risk management, because companies have required that for us to be able to use it. And on the proprietary side, you've had the opposite. Everybody hides away behind a contract with a liability clause, and they don't really understand what they're getting into their environment or the risks that it brings.
mm.
So, it won't surprise you that I'm a big advocate of it all being opened up. Not entirely sure that I can answer all of your questions there, but it's definitely worth a further discussion. And you remind me that we haven't done much in our talks around AI, and I'm going to get a couple of people to come and talk to us on that. So
Fantastic.
thank you for the reminder.
I would say
Wonderful.
just the last follow-up question to that,
Mhm.
and you were going really in a very uh, a very intellectually stimulating direction. It's about decentralized organizations. So
Mhm.
you're talking a lot about governance, right? So,
Yeah.
for example, right now, society has been able to use open source technology to
Mhm.
be able to govern how we share value without
Yeah.
intermediary, right? Through
Yeah.
Bitcoin and it's showing
Mhm.
blockchain technology's true value. And typically, if a company or someone created a technology that allowed us to share payment, that
Mhm.
individual would be liable to all of the different jurisdictions and have to have a banking license to be able
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But now we have an organization which allows us to do that, and
Mhm.
no company has sovereignty over that
Yeah.
national, which
Yeah.
is
Yeah. Yeah. And they're all panicking.
precisely. And
Yeah.
I don't think they should be panicking. I think one of the main reasons why they are panicking is because of this sense of control, that they feel like they're losing
Mhm.
control and that this can be used for money laundering. But
Mhm.
if you look at the amount of panic that they're having towards this open source technology compared to
Mhm.
closed source technology such as banking, proprietary banking, more money laundering happens in traditional banking than happens in
Yeah.
open source technology.
Yeah. Undoubtedly.
And
And there's a few different things you make me think about with all of that. I worked in places like Ukraine and Pakistan doing digital financial services for a couple of years.
mm,
Um, Particularly in places like Pakistan, it was really interesting because they didn't have cards the way we do. and they were just leaping ahead of us technology-wise and going straight into using credit on the phone and transferring that. So you would buy airtime and then be able to use the airtime to either transfer money, and you could do it across the mobile network. So you could be in Islamabad and you could send money to your father who was a sheep farmer up in the mountains in seconds without anybody having a bank account, and they could go and cash it out, you know, at the guy in the street corner who sold tomatoes. I mean, it literally was as basic as that, and it was quite incredible what it was doing. When I was working on that, the problem was it wasn't open, and now there is actually something that's spun out of the Gates Foundation, which does that on an open basis. It's called Moduloop. You might want to have a look at the work that that organization is doing. And they're really interesting. They're taking that kind of payment technology into places like the Ivory Coast, and they work on that whole, you know, give a man a fish and you feed him for a day, teach him to do something, and you can feed him for life. And they have the technology, and they're building local communities working around these whole payment platforms. I know it's not blockchain, but it is an interesting comparator to how by opening these things up, you can change stuff. On the organizational level you mentioned, I've tried to do some stuff with Open UK that's a bit different, and we are mostly run by volunteers, but we basically run like a bootstrapping startup. Although we're volunteers in the main, and I've not been paid for until recently for the majority of the time that I've worked. It's been a part-time role. Basically, I've worked full-time in a part-time employment, and then everybody else has volunteered. We're starting to shift to being able to pay for specific roles. But my way of rewarding people has been that I've arranged skills training, so personal development. So anybody who is a volunteer gets invited to a certain number of personal development courses in a year that we run. Interesting you mentioned storytelling, because that's one that we actually did, because I think it's really important when you present to be able to tell a story. It really shifts what you do. So we've looked at that kind of different way of running an organization, which I think is quite different. We also, and from a personal level, I've looked at some work done by a chap called Peter Koenig on Source, and Frederick Laloux, who talk a lot about organizational infrastructures and structuring. And they are big in the intrapreneur area. So people who are trying to make a difference and shift how companies work from the inside. And I believe that there is a big overlap and allegiance between that intrapreneur and open source movement, and those two movements probably need to collaborate more to change the future of business. But that's just my personal thoughts and not what I'm meant to be talking to you about.
genuinely such a great conversation, and I'll let other people chime in.
Thanks very much. Thanks for coming on tonight.
Thank you ever so much. Does anybody else have any questions for Amanda, bearing in mind obviously the time as well? Speak now or forever hold your peace.
Or drop me an email.
Or drop her an email. Yeah, you can speak now, drop Amanda an email, or regret the opportunity to do both.
Thanks very much for having me along.
No, it's been a privilege. Thank you ever so much for Amanda, and obviously Kavita for facilitating, and for Keith as well. Our door is very much always open to you. Please, please, please come back another day. Thank you ever so much to everyone for attending. Privileged to accommodate, and obviously with Amanda's permission, we'll be happy to share everything as per BCS standard procedures. And our door is always open for everybody. And thank you to everyone.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody.
Brilliant. Thank you. I'm going to love you and leave you. Thanks very much.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Night to everybody. Thanks a lot. Bye.